In part two of the presentation, I want to talk about the effects of soil parent material in assessing soil suitability. Two widely distributed soil parent material deposits are associated with glacial processes in Minnesota. These are so-called glacial till deposits associated with the ice that accompanied glacier movement across the landscape in the period from roughly 2 million years ago to about 10,000 years ago. And then glacial outwash, which is sands and gravel that were deposited from meltwater coming off of the ice sheet itself. In the upper diagram of this slide, you can see meltwater coming off of the ice sheet flowing across the landscape. This meltwater then will carry debris that is inside of the ice, and because it's moving water, the debris that it carries tends to be in the neighborhood of sands and gravels. And so that sand and gravel will be carried by glacial meltwater coming directly off of the ice sheet, flowing across the adjacent landscape, creating glacial outwash deposits of sands and gravels. In contrast to the glacial till deposits associated with ice, the underside of the ice, material buried inside of the ice, and marginal deposits where the ice sheet actually came to a stop. We can see the ice sheet, the ice margin of the sheet is here. Once the ice melts back, that has left behind a linear ridge or an end moraine landscape that contains the kind of deposits that were locked up inside and at the edges of the ice sheet. Two major types then are glacial till, which is mineral rubble that plucked, slid, carried, and dozed along with moving ice sheet. We can see in the diagram on the upper right, the ice sheet is moving across the landscape and it's picking up and carrying debris with it. Poorly sorted, containing boulders, cobbles, gravel, sand, and clay. The weight of the ice produces a dense subsoil because we're talking about ice that in some parts of the state was as much as 2 miles thick, typically more like half mile to a mile thick. So it produced very, very dense subsoils because of the weight that was constantly exerted on the underburden. Because of the high clay content, it may have low porosity and permeability, so it might have poor soil drainage, but because of the high clay content, it may be able to retain moisture. The glacial outwash, on the other hand, is sand and gravel deposits that came off of the meltwater at the downslope edge of the ice sheet. So in the diagram on the lower right, we can see over time the debris being brought along by the ice. As the ice melts back, that debris is left behind as a ground moraine till plain or as an end moraine till, a ridge system. And so we can talk about these till landscapes underneath and at the edge of the ice sheet and the outwash landscape at the downslope edge where the meltwater is flowing off of the ice itself. This aerial photograph gives a good sense of the overall configuration of these glacial till landscapes relative to the glacial outwash landscapes. Historically, the ice sheet would have come down to and approximated the edge of the red dashed line here. This was approximately the ice sheet margin. And at that point, it left behind a linear ridge. And that linear ridge is the same as this end moraine ridge that you see here. Underneath of the ice, then we had till deposits consisting of this rubble that you see being carried along inside and underneath of the ice sheet. And so those kinds of deposits are occurring in the right-hand side of the image. And then on the left-hand side of the image, we're talking about sands and gravels that have flowed off of the ice sheet and underneath of the ice sheet. So we're talking about these outwash plains that came off of the meltwater channels and the glacial meltwater coming off of the ice itself. The poorly sorted glacial till within and at the edge of the under the ice sheet is a hodgepodge of all kinds of things. We can see in the upper diagram on the right, we have very large boulders, with all kinds of other debris lodged inside of the ice. The upper left diagram shows finer material. We do have a couple of large boulders. And then as that material settles down or is deposited underneath, we can see boulders, we can see stones of varying sizes, we can see rocks, we can see gravel, we can see sands and clays. And right at the edge on the terminal moraine, then we can see that same level of unsorted debris being bulldozed along and deposited as the ice melts. Underneath of the ice sheet, the subglacial landscape produces low relief till plains, and we can see that they're generally speaking quite level, although they may have undulating characteristics to them. And the soil characteristics, again, consist of this hodgepodge of material of very large cobbles and rocks and much smaller particle size sands and gravels. Is this good for agriculture? Well, it's open, flatter, easier to farm, but it often contains rocks, which are harder to work. Farming in a landscape where you're constantly digging up stones this size can be hard business. It has clay in it, so it can hold water, but having clay in it, sometimes it doesn't drain very well. As we can see in the landscape on the upper left, where there's pool of water standing in the middle of the field. The outwash, on the other hand, is sandy, gravelly outwash deposits at the downslope edge of the ice sheet. This is from the flow from the ice sheet onto adjacent downslope landscapes, and it creates a sandy, gravelly parent material. Again, going back to the end moraine diagram, we can see the ground moraine and end moraine. This is the rubble of all kinds of material all jumbled up together, and then the very finely sorted outwash plain consisting of sands and gravels. The glacial outwash plain, then we can see the soil horizon is almost pure sand, and the sand is very flat, often easy to farm. It has sand, so it has good drainage to it, but the sand may also make the soil excessively droughty. It's good for sand and gravel mining because it's pure sand and gravel. It's the right stuff for mining operations. It's level, easy to mine, and it's right at the surface. You don't have to dig very deeply to recapture the resource. We can also talk about alluvium soils, which are also pure sand. These are soils deposited as a glacial stream overtops its banks and deposits its bedload of sands and gravels on the adjacent landscape. They tend to be pretty good for agriculture because they're often flatter and easier to farm. They have sand, so they have good drainage, but they may also be droughty, and they're also good for sand and gravel mining. Finally, we can talk about peatlands, which are often very flat and easier to farm, but they're often very waterlogged, have no drainage, very acidic, very low fertility, low soil oxygen levels. So generally speaking, low fertility for agriculture.